You're listening to the Spark Your Light podcast, episode number 251, How to Spark Creativity. Before I dive in, I want to say this episode is on video for anyone who wants to watch on video. Check it out on YouTube. This episode is for you if you want to tap into your creativity more frequently, whether you are a creative person, maybe you have a podcast or social media or a blog or a business or a career that requires you to be creative. Maybe you want to be more creative. Maybe you want to write a book or you want to share some creative ideas, but you sometimes struggle to tap into creativity. Maybe you're an entrepreneur. For whatever reason, you've been drawn to this episode title because you want to be better at connecting with creativity. This episode is for you. I'm going to be sharing my tried and true tips for how I create all of my content, which requires a lot of creativity. So this includes recording podcasts, writing newsletters. By the way, if you're not on my email list, I send a newsletter every single Wednesday. It's a midweek pick-me-up. It's usually an inspirational story, quote, journal prompts, something that's really going to just help you shift. So that's always linked in the show notes if you want to get on it. Random side note, because I know that not all of our newsletter subscribers are podcast listeners, and I know not all of our podcast listeners are newsletter subscribers, because depending on how you found me, if you heard me speak at an event and you subscribed to my newsletter at the event, you might not listen to the podcast, or if you found my newsletter on my website or from Instagram, you might not listen to the podcast. So anyways, vice versa, we have different people and different audiences. So if you want to be on the newsletter list, sign up for that. Random side note. So I have the podcast, I have the newsletter, I write books, constantly kind of working on my next book. Been working on book number 3 for a while, but I'm getting more and more serious about my ideas and where I want to take the reader, you, and getting it published. So writing books, which is a huge endeavor, and writing speeches, which is another challenge, requires a lot of storytelling, a lot of quotes that are inspiring, but they're quotes that are my own quotes versus sometimes in a newsletter or something, I'll use an inspirational quote from someone else. So instead, these are my own quotes. So we have all of those moving pieces where I have to create a lot of creative content and then social media content. So anyways, having a creative business requires a lot of creativity. And sometimes there's only so many life experiences I have. I mean, especially in the early days of being a mom, most of my days are spent with my son. Most of my days are spent in, comfy, what are they called? I can't even think of the name. Leggings that are shorts, biker shorts. Thank you, brain. Comfy biker shorts, a big t-shirt, and going for multiple walks with Michael, taking him to the library for story time, feeding him 100,000 times. And that's the extent of a lot of my days right now as a new mom. Naps, whether it's Michael napping on me or me napping. And so sometimes I'm like, what am I going to talk about for my audience? I want to inspire them, but nothing inspiring happened in my day. How am I going to share something that's valuable? And it's been really important to me to create consistent content. So one of the things I am most proud of is, long story short, with my experience in pregnancy, I found out at the beginning of my 3rd trimester that Michael was growth restricted, which, if you don't know what that means, it's a term that could be a variety of causes that's causing your baby to not be able to grow at an optimal rate inside of you, which means that your baby will have to be delivered early. Your baby will probably be small. Your baby may have problems after they are born. And depending on the cause of the growth restriction and how serious it is, that will determine when your baby needs to be born. So I was planning on recording, a couple of podcasts, maybe like 2 a week, and writing 2 newsletters a week and getting ahead on my content so that I could have a 3-month planned maternity leave where I'd have content scheduled. And so I'd be able to at least have podcast and newsletter, which are my main sources of content. I do post on social media, but that's not my main source of content really. And so I figured I would just post on social media if I wanted to, or I wouldn't. But I really wanted to have podcasts and newsletters going out every single week on a maternity leave. But when I was in my early 3rd trimester and I found out, hey, this is pretty serious, you might have to be induced soon, I was nowhere near prepared for that. And basically what would happen is I would go for these ultrasounds twice a week and non-stress tests. And anyone who's had any sort of high-risk pregnancy knows what I'm talking about, has been there. You have a million tests, a million appointments. So you're busy with that. You don't feel good because you're super pregnant. And for me, I didn't have a normal maternity leave. So I'm trying to create this maternity leave for myself. So I found out from my doctors pretty quickly that at any of my appointments, they could see something that was concerning enough that they would need to induce me immediately. So of course, all of the ultrasounds are at the hospital that I was delivering at. So before that, I could have gotten an ultrasound at sort of any hospital within their network. They had about 5 hospitals in their network. So I could go to whatever one had convenient time for me or was closer to my house. But now it was very serious. I had to go all my ultrasounds at the hospital that I was going to be delivering at. And I had to have my hospital bag packed and with me. And as it got closer and closer to, full term, my doctor encouraged that Richie be at all the appointments because if they were going to induce me, it would be pretty quick. And depending on how my body reacted to the induction, which, spoiler alert, it did not react well. It took forever. And I had to have an emergency C-section because it did not work. So it was quite a journey, but it could have been for some people very quick. And obviously I want my husband to be there for the birth of our child. And so it started to become this really high stress situation where I needed to get ahead on content quickly, which brings me to where a lot of my inspiration for this episode comes from. I used to really believe in this concept from the book Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. I still believe it. I'm going to put a caveat here. It's a great book. If you are interested in seeing how ideas can flow and they can have a life of their own, essentially one of her premises is that creative ideas are alive and they will land on you. And if you do not act on them, they will leave you and they will go to someone else. And she has many stories in the book that prove this. It's very fascinating. I highly recommend reading it if this interests you. But I used to use it as an excuse. So I still believe it, but I used to use it as an excuse. So I would have a list of podcast ideas. I would have a list of newsletter ideas. And if I didn't act on them right away, they kind of felt dead. It was like, I don't even know what I was talking about when I wrote that down. I don't really feel passionate about that idea anymore. It feels like, I don't really have any much to say about it. That's kind of how it felt. And I would use it as an excuse. And then I wouldn't be like, I don't know. I don't have any ideas. I don't know what to record. And then sometimes I would get a week or 2 behind. I was never behind in the sense that I didn't have content going out every week, but behind according to how ahead I wanted to be on my schedule. So this all came to a head when I now am potentially delivering at any appointment. So I keep telling myself, I need to be 3 months ahead on content yesterday because at my appointment tomorrow, I could be induced, right? And so I had to tap into a creative muscle that I have never had to tap into before. And it was one of the biggest blessings in the world. And that's really what I want to share with you here in this episode. So it's how to tap into creativity. Yes, we can be inspired into creativity. And that is beautiful and wonderful. And sometimes we have the most inspired ideas and they are amazing and they create incredible content. But I do not believe that we have to wait for inspiration. After all, if every artist and writer waits for inspiration, it could be years until they come up with their next piece of work. And that's probably where we get the concept of a starving artist from. But instead, we can choose to tap into creative inspiration and create our next piece of work sooner rather than later, which is exactly what I did. So I remember vividly, I got these tests called non-stress tests. If you've ever had one, if you've been pregnant, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, basically what they do is you sit in a comfy chair and they put these little, I don't even know what they are, like monitors, I guess you could call them, on your belly. They put the ultrasound jelly on and they like Velcro them around and they put them on your belly, like here and here. And these little monitors are one's monitoring the baby's heart rate and one is monitoring contractions. So usually you have these when you're closer to delivering. So they want to know, are you already having contractions? And they look for a certain number, a certain pattern of, I'm not a doctor. So there's probably an OB listening to this thinking, Jacqueline, this is not how to explain it whatsoever. So this is just my non-medical interpretation of this. I've had so many medical experiences with pregnancy and with Michael's health that I have no idea what's happening. I just have no medical background. So I just kind of go along for the ride and learn what I can. But basically they were checking for a certain number of heart rate, decelerations, accelerations, things like that to see if baby was healthy and moving and doing all these healthy movements that he or she should be doing. That was my interpretation of it, to make sure that baby was not stressed, essentially. And so you sit in this chair for, I think it was a minimum of 20 minutes, but it could be up to 60 minutes. So sometimes if baby wasn't having these kind of patterns, they would try to encourage baby to move because baby could be sleeping. And so the baby wouldn't be having these patterns. So they would give you like juice or tell you to walk around and try to get these patterns moving so that you could leave and make sure that obviously nothing was wrong with baby. And so sometimes you were sitting in the chair for even longer. It could be, I think, up to 60 minutes. So this was a perfect time for me to write my newsletters. I had sometimes almost 60 minutes to sit. And you could bring a laptop. I would bring my laptop back, but sometimes I would write on my phone because sometimes I just write in a note on my phone and then later upload it to my website, to my email program where I schedule my emails. And so either way, if I brought my laptop or I just have my phone, I could write my newsletters. But I had to force myself to tap into creative energy. So here are some of the things that I did that really helped and allowed me to write 12 weeks of email newsletters and record 12 weeks of podcasts within a period of probably about 2 weeks. I did all of that. And the content was great, which is the best part. I feel that it is proven now, at least for me in my experience, that you can create just as good of content and just as creative ideas when you are a little bit more intentional about tapping into the creativity as when you are just randomly inspired. So the first thing I did was I looked at things that inspired me and that maybe were possible to spark ideas. So for me, this was Pinterest. For you, this could be reading a certain book, scrolling through, I don't know, a certain like let's say you're a painter. I just use this example because I think it's a really great visual picture of art. It's such a creative thing. Maybe you're scrolling through artwork from your favorite artist. It's just to spark some inspiration. It's not to do exactly what they're doing or copy them or anything like that. But, I love the way purple is a color in this painting. I'm going to make purple the main color of my painting. And oh my gosh, you know what? I've always wanted to do purple with yellow. I am not an artist at all. I can't even draw a stick figure. But I'm just kind of going along the lines of how creative ideas are formed. And so the same would happen for me. I might look at Pinterest and I might see a quote and I might want to share that quote. And then I might want to share a story where I experienced something that taught me that lesson. Or maybe I see a quote that's about resilience and I think, if resilience is a great topic, what do I have to say about resilience right now? What has been, and I'll actually ask myself a question. Questions are incredible. Tony Robbins' famous quote, the power of your life is determined by the power of questions you ask. If you ask yourself the right questions, you can spark creativity. So I might ask myself something like, well, what has been helping me tap into my resilience recently? Or what is a time in the past week where I've needed to exhibit resilience? And then I'm like, oh, when this thing happened. And I'm like, well, why don't I tell that story and then share my tip about resilience? Oh, that would be a great newsletter, right? Or that would be a great podcast. So before I know it, I'm often coming up with ideas very quickly. Sometimes I look at my own work and I look at what are people loving? So for the podcast, I look at what are our most downloaded episodes ever? What are people most interested in? What has helped them the most? And can I create something different but similar? So along the same thought process, because clearly that thought process really resonated. And so that is one thing that can really, really help your own creative work. Sometimes I just say to myself, what do I think my audience needs to hear? What do I want to say? What's on my heart? And I just force myself to create something in a container. So I think one of the biggest pieces of this, outside of the inspiration that you're kind of seeking out with looking at content that inspires you, or looking at, your own content, is creating a container. So it's kind of a two-part approach. One part is, an external piece that might spark something, whether it's just questions to yourself or you're going to actually look at something. And then part two is a physical container. So create a container for yourself. Create a container where you actually have a set start and end time where you're going to do this creative thing. So I actually did this now in hindsight when I look back and I start to notice that this is a pattern for me of sparking creativity. When I wrote my book, I would go to a coffee shop and I would sit down and I would decide, okay, I'm going to write a chapter. And it's nice to just give yourself a doable, bite-size, creative assignment, essentially. Because if you're like, I'm going to just work on my book, it can feel really intimidating. But if you say, I'm just going to write one chapter, it's a lot easier to get your brain around the fact that, okay, I can do this. Yes, I can do one chapter. It's not that much. It's not that overwhelming. And then when you sit down to do it, well, you might be like, I have an idea for the second chapter and I'm going to work on my next chapter after I finish this one. And you might even do more, but at least to have a container for your brain, that is extremely helpful. So the container plus the spark, it's basically like you have a box of fireworks and then you actually have the spark to set off the fireworks. That's essentially what you're doing with your creative ideas. And like I said, I have found some of the best creative ideas by doing this process. So I think it's really magical. And while I do believe that creative ideas are alive, I have experienced the things Elizabeth Gilbert talks about in Big Magic. I also believe that we can choose to summon those ideas and attract them to us by deciding. It's like manifestation. I am deciding what I get to have. And I am deciding that right now I'm going to write a newsletter and I'm not going to get up until I do it. Right. And it goes along with what I taught in the recent episode about the phrases that I never say. And one of them was, I'll try, because you don't say, I'll try to write a newsletter. No, I'm going to sit down and until I come up with an idea, I'm not going to get up. I'm going to write a newsletter, period. And you do it. So our creativity does not have to be something we wait around for. Our inspiration does not have to be something we wait around for. Whether it's a business idea that you're looking for, something in your career, or maybe you also create content and you find yourself waiting around. You don't have to. You can just tap into it. You can use some of those external sparks. You can use some of those questions that prompt some things. and create that container. And when you do that, you will be impressed with how many creative ideas you will have. And the more real you can make the container, the better. So for me, having this container of recording video podcast episodes at a studio where I actually had to book a time, I had to come up with my creative ideas for what I was going to record my episodes about. I was forced. That's actually what inspired this episode today, because I thought, you know what's so fascinating? I was able to create these inspired ideas for these episodes I wanted to record today just because I had a container and there was a deadline. It's sort of like if you're a procrastinator, which if you struggle with perfectionism, you might find that you also struggle with procrastination. If that is you and you are like, oh my gosh, that is so me, I want you to go back and listen to my episode with Sam Laura Brown. I will also make sure that that is linked in the show notes, because it is a fantastic episode on how those two concepts are linked and how you can unlink them and start to heal some of those tendencies. But they're super linked. And so if you struggle with procrastination, you probably also struggle with perfectionism. And you were probably the student in school that waited till the last minute to turn in your paper. And you might have told yourself the lie that I come up with my best ideas right before the deadline. I write my best papers the night before they're due, right? I definitely would tell myself that sometimes. There might be a little truth to it in the sense that when you have a deadline, when you have a container, you're forced to come up with something. And a lot of times, all the time, you just will. You just will tap into your creativity. My best ideas ever, a lot of times, I'm not even trying to come up with an idea. But some of the time, I've really come up with some ideas that land so well just from deciding I was going to do it and choosing to tap into that creativity. So if that's you, you have all the tools you need. It's time to tap into that creativity. Schedule it out on your calendar. Seek out some inspiration and just do it. That's when you're going to come up with some really, really great ideas. Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. I hope it helped you spark some creativity. I hope you have a wonderful creative week, and I will catch you in the next episode.